Ukraine may be facing its darkest hour as a deadlock in Washington over military aid leaves it all but defenceless against the massive Russian missile bombardments which are devastating its power stations.
Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of yet another. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with attacks on power stations because that is what has dominated the news over the last week. Both the attacks on Ukraine's conventional power stations and drone strikes against the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which have sparked warnings from the International Atomic Agency of a possible meltdown of a major atomic incident, a major nuclear incident. We'll start with what was happening at Zaporizhia. The IAEA, the UN body, reported 3 drone strikes which struck the plant in the most significant military action since November 2022. At least one of those drones hit the concrete housing surrounding reactor number 6, leaving scorch marks. The other 2 drones damaging nearby buildings. Now, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, blamed each other for these attacks. Ukraine has previously denied attacking the plant. What was interesting here was that the UN monitors from the IEA were on site at the time and reported seeing drones being struck down. Immensely worrying because this nuclear power plant, the Zaporizhia plant, has been on the front line since the first weeks of the war. Russian forces were accused of putting their troops and guns in the plant, but the UN insists that is no longer the case, that there may be Russian positions nearby, but they're not in the plant. Unclear exactly who was behind this. The UN did not attribute blame. Ukraine denying it. The plant is held by Russia. From an outside point of view, concerning because, of course, Ukraine has the awful history of having hosted the worst civil nuclear disaster in human history when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, and the anniversary of that catastrophe coming up this month. More broadly, though, this week, the focus has been on Ukraine's conventional power plants, the power infrastructure that gives Ukraine its electricity. They have been hammered by a series of Russian bombardments, most notably on the night of the 10th to the 11th of April earlier this week. Some 82 missiles and drones fired across Ukraine. Among them, 42 missiles. Ukraine said it was barely able to shoot a dozen of them down. And that is what's key here, is that Ukraine is making the point it does not have sufficient air defenses to protect its power stations from these attacks. And the shortage of those defenses is clearly linked to the ongoing wrangle in Washington, D.C., in America, over a £60 billion worth of aid, military aid, which the White House wants to send, but which Republicans are holding up. Now, we'll stay on just the physical impact of those strikes. The Tribulska power plant, about 50 kilometers south of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, was hit. Senior officials from Ukraine's energy company saying the devastation, the damage caused was immense, and that created a blackout in Kyiv region. In Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, the mayor there saying that 10 missiles hit power infrastructure, leaving some 200,000 people without energy. Officials also reporting strikes in Lviv in the far west near the Polish border, in Zaporizhia in the center of the country, and in Odessa region in the south. Now, this was the 3rd major attack against Ukraine's energy infrastructure this year, and it appears to be a continuation of what was a failed attempt early in the war by Russia to cripple Ukraine's energy infrastructure, that Ukraine narrowly survived that first time. It's not just a question of leaving people without power. And when Russia first attempted it, it was seen as an attempt to try and break people's will, to leave them cold and in the dark during the long winters of the war. But now there's another consequence that's been highlighted by the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank which tracks this conflict, pointing out that the lack of electricity will also hinder Ukraine's industry, crucially, perhaps its ability to manufacture arms, because as this war has progressed, as it has dragged on, Ukraine has increasingly leaned into building up its own capability to try and manufacture and repair its own weapons. And of course, the need for that has become increasingly clear as the reliability, the steadfastness of its allies has come into question. And that's really where we're going to go next in today's update, which is, where is America? The reason that Ukraine does not have sufficient air defense systems, particularly the Patriot air defense systems, which so far have been the only ones capable of shooting down Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, the reason Ukraine does not have enough is because this huge package of military aid, which the White House wanted to deliver in December, has been held up in Congress, held up in Washington, D.C. by a political impasse between the Democrats of Joe Biden's government and the Republicans, informally led by former President Donald Trump, who appears to be pulling the strings behind the scene. Now, part of this can be seen as perhaps US isolationism, a long-standing sort of historic thread within American foreign policy, which is that problems over there in Europe are not America's problems. They bring up the Atlantic drawbridge. But actually there is also concern and perhaps growing evidence that there is a cohort within the far right of the hard right, rather, of the Republican Party, who are just actively pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian. And worth remembering when we think about this, that Donald Trump, when he was first impeached during his presidency, was impeached over claims that he had misused his office to try and bully President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine into digging up dirt about his then rival and his continuing rival, Joe Biden, and the Biden family over President Biden's son's business dealings in Ukraine. That's a story that hasn't perhaps had enough traction in the United Kingdom, and perhaps we don't consider enough when we think about what might be behind the Republican motives for being cool on Ukraine and cozy towards Moscow. What's really interesting as well is this has led us to an almost sort of, perhaps not unprecedented, but certainly an extraordinary point in international relations, where we are seeing more and more of Ukraine's allies, of Britain's allies and European nations, and indeed recently Japan, being more and more outspoken in their pressure and expressing their concerns and demands of America to step up and play its part. Now, international diplomats are well aware that no country likes being told what to do by others, and therefore these messages are sort of couched in diplomatic language. But essentially the message is this from Ukraine's allies, from America's allies: America needs to play its part. We saw Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, travelling to America, where he met former President Donald Trump in his Florida Mar-a-Lago property. The details of that meeting have not been revealed. Cameron said it was a private meeting, but interestingly, Cameron was unable to meet the Republican Speaker Mike Johnson, who he'd publicly said he intended to meet during that visit. Speaker Johnson's office saying he was unable to find the time, but clearly a snub. Cameron's message was that America needs to play its part. Poland's Foreign Secretary Radek Sikorski has issued a similar kind of appeal. He said American credibility is at stake because President Joe Biden traveled to Kyiv. He made the promise to Ukraine during wartime that America would do whatever it takes to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And yet, here we are, America paralyzed by this wrangle between the Democrats and the Republicans, America unable to deliver that tranche of military aid. And just this week, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida saying that America is indispensable, trying to deliver that message to a joint session of Congress, saying that America is indispensable and urging those politicians not to draw up the Atlantic drawbridge, not to retreat into isolationism, but to embrace the role that America has carved for itself within the world. how America responds, how America moves forward will remain absolutely critical. And it's perhaps not a stretch to say that at the moment, Donald Trump, the former president, the Republican challenger likely to go against Joe Biden in the elections later this year, and Speaker Mike Johnson, the head of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, are holding Ukraine's fate in their hands because they are the ones who appear to hold the keys as to whether or not America will release this aid. The stakes could not be higher. I mean, President Zelensky has accused America of turning a blind eye. America's top general in Europe, the commander of European forces, or commander of American forces in Europe, rather, General Cavoli, recently gave evidence to lawmakers saying that Ukraine was currently being outgunned on the front lines by about 5-1, that Russia had 5 times more ammunition at its disposal than Ukraine did. He said within weeks that would become 10-1, and without more American help quickly, the situation for Ukraine remains bleak and will only get worse. As ever, thank you always for your questions. If you're watching on YouTube, please do ask your questions in the comments below and we will endeavour to answer them next time. There are a couple of questions from last week's show. The first is about the Swedish Gripen fighters, and is Ukraine going to get these fighter jets? We know there's an international community trying to deliver F-16s to Ukraine. Ukraine's been very outspoken that it wants those aircraft to defend itself from Russian jets. Sweden has said it remains open to the idea of providing its Gripen fighters, but they have not yet been committed and they certainly have not been delivered. The reason it's interesting is that there was a very stark assessment by the Royal United Servicemen's Institute, a military think tank here in London, saying that the Gripens were by far the most suitable fighter jets for Ukraine's allies to give to Ukraine. And in simple terms, that's because Sweden designed these jets in order to fight from dispersed airfields against Russian aircraft and against Russian air defences. And the dispersal thing is key because aircraft that remain on major air bases, major airfields, are vulnerable to attacks from missiles and other aircraft and need a lot of defences, air defences, to protect them. The F-16s, whilst they are formidable fighter jets, are, if you like, very sensitive. They need very clean runways because if they suck debris into their engines, that will stop them flying or hinder their performance. The Gripens are designed to be more resilient. So effectively they can be flown off roads, motorways around the country, which might not necessarily be bases. So they can take off and land at different places with smaller supporting infrastructure, which makes them more mobile, more resilient, harder for the Russian forces to target. Another theme that came out a lot in the comments underneath last week's show was whether or not it was fair of Lord Cameron, Britain's Foreign Secretary, to compare the crisis facing Ukraine and the world now to 1938. A lot of you saying, well, actually, the 1938 moment was not now, it was in 2014. And that, I think, is a fair historical observation. Cameron's reference was comparing what is happening now to what happened when Nazi leader Adolf Hitler annexed the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. That was seen as a forerunner to World War II, but instead of resisting him, instead of stopping him or pushing him backwards, European powers appeased Nazi Germany, paving the way for one of the bloodiest conflicts the continent had ever seen. Of course, a very similar thing happened in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and when it supported the rebellion, the uprising in eastern, or fomented the uprising in eastern Donbass in parts of Lugansk and Donetsk districts. The West collectively did very little. It failed to push Russia out, and it's clear to see the course of events which has led us from there in 2014 to now, where Ukraine finds itself fighting a hot war, the worst conflict Europe has seen since the end of World War II on its territory. I think it's a fair historical point, so thank you very much for making that. Nonetheless, I think there's also merit in the message that Cameron was delivering, which is this is a critical moment in history, and indeed in the history of Europe, where Europe and the world must make a decision as to whether or not it's prepared to continue to allow a tyrant in Moscow to define the borders of Europe by force. As ever, thank you very much for watching and listening. If you do have questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and we'll endeavour to answer them again next time. If you're listening, then do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to The Sun, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.